All right, welcome in everybody to Pickaxe and Roll, brought to you by good friends here at Mile High Sports. I am your host, Ryan Blackburn at NBA Blackburn on Twitter, part of the Mile High Sports Podcast Network. On this episode, we have a very special guest. He is Jake Coyne at the Stat Squatch on Twitter, the owner of the manifesto that drops every single year and does a great job of I think laying out the different scenarios and situations that Denver has at their disposal, what they can do, what they should be trying to do, different players they can target, things like that. It is an excellent resource for anybody like me that really wants to be like knowledgeable on the way that Denver's going to approach the offseason, how they're going to approach certain things. And Jake, you do a fantastic job of this thing every year. I had to have you on. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing really well, and appreciate the kind words as always. And we put you, who I know is typically a little lower on the Nuggets than some people in the local media. You put it together with me, who always has a million trade ideas and stuff, and it's a dangerous combination. So we'll see what comes up in this little chat here.
I love it. There's so many different ways that I think we can approach this, but one first thing that we should probably do is talk about the way the season ended and how much you think Denver should change. There has been a lot of discussion, I think, about running it back, though some of the terminology that Josh Kroenke has used about internal development. And the way that I've kind of posited that is that the only reason that Denver is using that terminology right now after 2 years of failing is that they didn't have a choice. They don't really have a choice other than internal development because they don't have external ways to get that much better. And so I've kind of been out on an island on that one, but we talked on Locked On, and you said a very similar thing. How much do you look at Denver's, like the way that they ended the playoffs this year, the way they ended the playoffs last year, and think how much better do they actually need to get to have a good chance to win a title?
Yeah, so I think every team, they get to the end of the year and they kind of have to look back and decide what type of team they were. And I think it's a little more nuanced than just you win it or you don't. I think you need to put yourself in a position to be like one of the top teams. And sometimes injuries will make it so you don't get there. Sometimes bad matchups, because I think pretty much every team is prone to bad matchups. Those types of things can prevent you from winning it, but you need to decide if you're in that tier where if things kind of roll the right way, you do have a chance to win it. And I think that's what Denver needs to kind of figure out is, are they more so the team that took the likely NBA champion Thunder to 7 games, or are they more similar to who we saw in the regular season? And you could even say was taken to a game 7 by the Clippers, who most people would say is not close to winning it all. And that's what Denver needs to decide. And I think we'll be able to know by some of their moves this summer where they think they are in that.
I think it's just based off of what we've heard and based off of well, they haven't added a new general manager yet. It feels like actually I wanted to ask you about that too. Like you've had some experience just kind of being in and around like these different mechanisms. Um, how important is it for Denver to add their main decision maker prior to the NBA draft and prior to free agency? Because it feels like they're taking their time here. And I remember when they added Tim Connolly, it was like 3 days before the draft when they finally decided on who they're going to make their general manager. And they ultimately said, hey, you're going to trade the first round pick, which ended up being Rudy Gobert. And they traded it for cash and Eric Green. And they made like what was possibly a very massive error right at the beginning of his tenure because they didn't have enough time to prepare. How much time does a general manager need to prepare for what Denver has to do?
Yeah, well, I think first it probably depends on what type of general manager you're hiring. If you're bringing in a guy who already has a really strong relationship with agents and their players, he might need a little bit less of a runway to get where he needs to be. But if you're bringing in a guy who, doesn't have a ton of experience negotiating with those people, He's going to need more time to develop relationships and get to a point where agents are comfortable talking to him. They know what to expect when they get on the phone with him, things like that. But the reality is, we're less than 3 weeks now from the draft, and we are 3 weeks and change from free agency negotiation period opening up. But those conversations are all kind of happening already. Like, there are trade conversations happening, whether the NBA wants to admit it or not. I'm sure there's free agent contracts being thrown around right now behind closed doors. And so I think, the sooner the better. I would be shocked if we go more than another week without hearing about a hiring. If they do, I would probably start to get pretty concerned.
We're recording this on Thursday, kind of late morning. This will come out on Friday, and then maybe a second part of it on Saturday. But I just, for that added context for folks, on Thursday, June 5th is when we are saying this. So if Denver doesn't have a general manager by Thursday, June 12th, then we can start to be a little bit concerned. That, I think, is a fair question. Unless, of course, Denver's not planning on changing much. Unless they're planning on just running it back and trying to keep the status quo and maybe add some stuff on the edges, but nothing that's like an actual tangible rotation player, which personally, Jake, I think would be a mistake. I think that Denver needs to get as deep as possible if they are going to run it back. And the way that you do that is you have to get creative. You have to find, you have to develop those relationships with agents where you can effectively say, hey, you're going to take a minimum contract for us, but we're still going to give you an opportunity to actually play. And unless you're able to tell agents that and players that, they're never going to trust you. They're never going to sign with you. And Denver, I don't think, other than Russell Westbrook, has never really had a minimum guy that has stepped in and played a significant role. Well, okay, Justin Holiday did, but that was honestly because of necessity, because they decided to go with 3 rookies that year. So I think that Denver needs to be aggressive. I think that this is a time to be proactive and not reactive. There are 4 mechanisms, and I talked to you about this before we started. For me, 4 mechanisms in which Denver can tangibly get better this offseason, and really every offseason. Internal development, the draft, free agency, and trades. Those 4, obviously, the draft, they don't have any draft picks this year. We don't really need to talk too much about that. Are there ways that, should Denver be trying to get back into the draft? Is there a reason why they should use another full-time roster spot on a draft pick? I can't think of one.
Yeah, so I think, one thing that we do have to know is that even though Denver doesn't have a draft pick, it's not like all the scouts and stuff in the organization just threw their hands up and said, oh, we don't have a pick, we're not going to scout anybody this year, right? They've all been doing their job, and they have a list of players that they like in this draft, regardless of their pick situation. As far as, needing to add a player like that, I don't think there's a need. However, I would just note that depending on what other moves Denver makes, it might make some sense to trade into the back half of that second round and draft a player and sign him to a really cost-friendly deal. Because depending on what else Denver does, you might be pushing up against some of those tax aprons. And when you're able to draft a guy, you're able to keep that cap number a little lower than you would like an undrafted free agent. There's something called tax variance that comes into play. And so being able to have a guy with draft rights who you sign to a cheap deal can be really beneficial as like a 15th or 14th roster spot if you're really pushing up against those aprons. And we saw that last year with the Knicks. They were pushing up against some aprons, and they were debating who to add at that last roster spot. You can go back and read some articles about this tax variance issue and why they could and couldn't sign certain guys to it. And so there is kind of a financial reason that they could want to do it. But as far as we need to add a draft pick for team building purposes, I don't think there's a super big need there.
The other thing, of course, is that they would need to have a plan. And if you don't have a general manager, that of course is that can get a little bit dicey really quickly if you're assuming that you're going to get somebody in free agency or in trade in the coming days, but then have to make that pick before all of those things actually come to pass. So that could be a little sketchy. Circling back to internal development, there are, I think, 4 different groups of players on the Nuggets roster. One is young guys. One is the young guys that I don't really think have much of a ceiling. One is Deron Holmes by himself, who I'm kind of putting into his own box because of the Achilles injury. And the other is players that I don't think will get better. How much better do you actually think that Christian Brown, Peyton Watson, Julian Strawther, those guys can get?
It's a good question. I think, starting off with Christian Brown, who's probably the most important piece there. I would like to see some improvement in just kind of his decisiveness. I think, we saw a lot of those record scratch possessions where maybe he could have taken a shot and decided to pass it up. I think in Denver's offensive system, you just need to be able to take those shots without second guessing yourself. And so I'd kind of like to see more of those types of improvements for Christian. Then moving down to kind of Julian and Peyton, I think they both, in their own ways, kind of need to improve some defensive IQ stuff. Obviously, Peyton's a lot better of a defender right now than Julian is. But I think they could both improve in that way. And it would really push Peyton to another level defensively, I think, as he learns some more things about playing defense in the NBA. And with Julian, I think we're kind of at the point here where, we need you to see you make a lot of shots. Not necessarily by volume, but I believe right now he's under 35% career from 3. And, there is context to those numbers. Like his first year with Jokic on the floor, he actually was close to 40%, I want to say, on limited attempts. But this year, it was kind of not the best with or without Jokic. And so Julian, I think we kind of need to see hey, this is your reputation. You're a shot maker. We need to see you being able to do that. So those are kind of the improvements I'd look for in those guys. And yeah, we'll see if they can at least get, 2 of those guys to look like they take a step forward this year. They'd probably be in a good place.
Of course. It really is the only way for Denver's roster to get that much better without making those additional moves. So I'm 100% with you there. Really quickly, I'm looking up Julian's 3-point percentage with Jokic on the floor. 32% with Jokic on the floor this year, and then 36.7 without him. So if that is one of those things that maybe there's a little bit of variance that goes the other direction in his 3rd season, I kind of think that one of the factors for him, whenever Porter was off the floor, whenever Murray was off the floor, if it's just Jokic and Julian Strawther, there's only so many guys that the opposing team has to really account for at the 3-point line. So would be nice if Denver had multiple guys that you had to actually close out to at the same time. And then maybe Julian's job gets a little bit easier there. But then again, that's Julian's job, is to space the floor. So you have to do it. Jalen Pickett, Hunter Tyson. What's the feeling there on those guys, specifically Pickett? How much better do you think he can get?
Yeah, Pickett is an interesting one because I think there's probably a subset of Nuggets fans who are very comfortable going into this season with him as your backup point guard. And then I think there's another set that would say, oh, we need a different backup point guard, just in case Pickett doesn't work out. I probably fall more into the second one. A lot of people will point to that triple-double he had. It was either in his first or second career start, right? Surprisingly, that's not super uncommon. I think they're Theo Pinson, if anybody remembers him, I think he did that. So it's not a indicator of being a great player, right?
Yeah.
But we did see things out of Pickett that I liked. I thought he had some good composure, especially in his playoff minutes. But there's also issues with him. I think, he's not the type of guard that I would like to see Denver playing a lot. He's not going to drive by people, make aggressive plays at the rim, which Westbrook did. and which is one of the reasons I think Westbrook was helpful. So with Pickett, we'll have to see. It probably depends on his role, how much improvement to expect from him. And then just kind of a quick little note on Tyson. I think it's fair to go into the season planning on not getting a contribution from him, and whatever you get from him is kind of icing on the cake, right? Hopefully we see good shot making from him, hitting open shots when he gets on the floor, and just sort of, not being a complete traffic cone on defense, right? I think those would be the things you'd ask from Tyson, and maybe he'll earn some minutes as the season goes on.
On Tyson, a guy who comes to mind is Jake LaRavia, who I thought was horrible every time I watched him for his first 2 seasons. And then now I'm going to talk about him as a taxpayer MLE candidate for Denver, somebody who maybe like just needed 1 extra year to try to figure some stuff out. So that's the vision with Tyson, I think, is to hope that turns around. On Pickett, I am leaning towards, there are 2 guys that I come to mind with him, Monte Morris and Jordan McLaughlin. I think he's more Jordan McLaughlin than Monte Morris personally, which would imply that you're a 3rd point guard in the NBA as opposed to a 2nd point guard who can like step in on occasion and be a consistent guy in the regular season when you need him in a pinch, but not necessarily that guy that you have to count on night in and night out. And that's not really an insult. He, like, the way that he was drafted, like, he wasn't really in the top 50 of most draft boards. And it was a very aggressive pick when Calvin Booth made it. And now Denver just has to kind of adjust around that, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just on Pickett, I was just going to say, I know he was a high 2nd round pick, but he was a 2nd round pick. If he ends up being a reliable 3rd and occasional 2nd string point guard, I don't think that's the worst thing. With a 2nd round pick, you could do worse than that. So,
oh yeah. Deron Holmes, like, you've done this before in terms of trying to figure out and project out what certain guys are going to do. Guys that come off of injuries like his, what's a fair minute marker and rotation spot for him within the pecking order for a rotation that Nuggets fans can expect?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, he is a young player still. And so you're not probably baking in a ton of extended stretches of rest, like where he needs multiple games off in a row to kind of come back from this injury. He's a young enough player that I think you could just say, hey, as long as you're feeling good every night, we'll play you 82 games if you're feeling it. Maybe some occasional back-to-backs, it's a little sore and he misses or whatever. But as far as like on a minute per game basis, I think if we think back to like Michael Porter Jr.'s rookie season, and obviously that was under a different head coach, and Michael Porter was probably a better prospect. Well, not probably, he was a better prospect than Deron Holmes. So it's a little different, but think back to that. And Michael Porter wasn't in the rotation every night to start off. I think we'll probably see something similar where Holmes is definitely getting his shot. Like, we don't have to wait for someone to get injured for him to be playing. He will play, but I just wouldn't be surprised if there's nights where he doesn't, based on matchups. And then based on what we see in those minutes, by December, it's possible he's an every night guy. And then maybe by April or something, going into the playoffs, he's like a 15 to 20 minute per night guy. If you're getting 15 to 20 from him by the end of the regular season, it's a big win.
Oh yeah.
And if you're even getting 8 to 10 in the playoffs from him as a rookie, I think that's a big win as well. So I think that would probably be the ceiling of what we're looking at for him this year.
I mean, that would be sick. That would be, it is like your own free agency edition, that it's another mechanism for adding a true rotation player if you're able to do that. I'm a little bit lower, not on Deron Holmes, but just on the average, like what's the most likely outcome for him in this situation. I would probably project more like 10 to 12 minutes per game on average. And maybe he jumps in as like, he'll be a garbage time guy pretty much every single time, but he'll also be like maybe your 11th man. So we'll see what happens with it, but I like he would be great. I very high on the pick. It was one of the things I thought Calvin Booth like aggressively did really well to try to get somebody like that. So we'll see if he can show it. Um, on the rest of the roster, I don't really see any other massive improvement candidates. Do you?
I don't think so. The only guy that's probably worth mentioning is just Zeke Naji. With this new coaching staff, is he able to maybe have a little bit of a fresh start and he's more of a rotation consideration right away? Maybe, I don't know. Zeke's a interesting one that some of the things you wish he was good at, he's not very good at. So he's not a great screener. He's not a great rebounder. And for the roles that I think Denver would like to put him in, he would need to be better at those skills. So if he comes back and looks significantly improved in one or both of those areas, that would be really helpful. But it is not something I would count on.
It's just like if they were going to play. So I get very frustrated about this from the is he a 4, is he a 5 conversation. Because if he was a 4, he would be able to handle the basketball a little bit better and shoot the ball more consistently and be somebody that could do those things. And he doesn't really do that. And I just every time somebody is like, "Well, you just have to play him at the 4," like how? Like why? Like there's so many other guys on Denver's roster that are going to be deserving minutes at the power forward spot,
Yeah.
and I've run out of patience as many other Nuggets fans have. So it has to be now, or like in all likelihood, Denver will be trying to throw him into some of these trade packages that we're talking about to see if they can get themselves better.
Yeah, for sure. And, one last thing on the Zeke thing. I don't think I've ever talked about this, but one thing that did bother me was, shortly after the Malone firing, there was a national article that came out and it noted Zeke's plus minus as a 4 versus as a 5, and kind of used that as evidence of Malone using him incorrectly. And I just wanted to point out that when he's been a 4, he's been next to Jokic for at least a good chunk of that. And so there's a reason his plus minus as a 4 would look a lot better than it does as a 5 when he's never next to Jokic. So uh, always context to numbers. And that's important to remember.
Whenever he plays the 4, he also plays against the Utah Jazz and the
Yeah.
Sacramento Kings and the New Orleans Pelicans and those kinds of teams as well. That is the most important context to me, is
Yep.
that the only reason they're ever putting him in those situations is because they can. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to start chatting about free agency. This is the key where Denver has only a couple of ways that they can do it, but they got to get it right this time because they haven't gotten it right in the previous couple of years. We'll be right back here on Pickaxe and Roll. And we are back. Pickaxe and Roll. Ryan Blackburn here. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below. Would really, really appreciate it. All right, Jake. We are here. The ultimate moment for off season is free agency. It's where everything goes crazy. You've already talked about, yeah, guys are already talking through deals. They're already talking through different mechanisms of how to improve their teams. Agents are having these calls. GMs are having these calls. Everybody's making calls right now. Right now, with where Denver's salary cap situation is, and you can speak to this better than anybody, Denver's has 2 ways that they can sign free agents. They have one taxpayer mid-level exception that's worth about 5.7 million in 2025-26, and then I believe it increases 5% in the following season. And then they have minimum contracts. And that's it. That's where Denver's at. If they are above the first apron and below the second apron, they have a TPMLE and minimum contracts, and that's it. Am I missing anything there?
Nope, that is it. Only way that they could possibly open up something else is if they were to do like a MPJ for Cam Johnson trade. you're losing enough salary there that maybe you're opening up the bigger MLE, at least part of it. But barring something like that, you're just looking at the taxpayer mid-level and those minimum deals.
That will come up. Just as everybody knows, that is a very popular mechanism, and I think a very popular mechanism for a lot of NBA teams. Let me just say. Um, so, other than that, is there a viable way to create more space for the non-taxpayer mid-level? Is there, which is again, it's 13 million per season. It's a bigger contract that Denver can throw out there. There's a lot of guys that they could really use that are going to be going for that kind of non-taxpayer mid-level money. Is there another way that they could free up space other than trading one of their core four?
I mean, probably not. If you traded Zeke and Dario and took nothing back, you might be able to get in that range. But one thing you have to think about that I know a lot of people can get confused on with that non-taxpayer MLE is it's not you get below the first apron and then you can use it to go over the first apron. That's not how it works. If you use the non-taxpayer MLE, you have to stay below the first apron the rest of the year. You cannot go over it. Yep,
Yeah.
it hard caps you at that first apron. So I have seen some confusion there, like, oh, we could dump this salary and then we're under the first apron and we can sign Nickeil Alexander-Walker or something, right? That's not the case. You have to stay under it the rest of the season. I'd have to sit down and do the math on that, but I think if they dumped Zeke and Dario, you're probably looking at least being able to use part of the taxpayer MLE. But it would be tight. I think that would only put you 10 million under, if I'm doing the math off the top of my head, right?
Yeah, that's not. So I'm looking at it right now. Denver is currently 3.5 million over the first apron.
Yep.
And if they were to dump Zeke Naji, who's making 8.1, Dario, who's making 5.4, you kind of combine those together, it's about 13.6. So you are 100% correct. It is about 10 million over. But the problem, of course, that you run into is that if you have other roster spots that you have to fill out and you have 10 million in space, which means that if you're committing, we'll say 2.2 million to 3 other minimum contracts, then you really only have 4 million for the non-taxpayer mid-level. So it is hard to really justify. At that point, you just would want to be in the first apron and use the taxpayer mid-level. Like you would just, because it's 5.7.
Yeah. So all that to say, realistically, you'd have to chop off, probably 15 or I guess 18 to 20 million in total salary to really get in range of at least using part of that bigger one. So probably not super realistic there. So yeah, we are looking at taxpayer mid-level and some minimum deals.
Okay. How many rotation players should Nuggets fans expect Denver to be able to add in free agency?
I think in the regular season, you'd be shooting for 2. One with the mid-level exception and one on a minimum deal that's at least a most of the night rotation guy. And then I think in the playoffs, you're hoping that mid-level guy is still a rotation piece. And if the minimum guy, maybe he's your 10th guy or something, and he's not really an every night playoff guy, I think that's totally fine. But I think you're probably shooting for 2, one with a minimum and one with the MLE. And then you're hoping Holmes can be kind of a rotation guy. So then you're looking at 3 new rotation guys, right? But in free agency specifically, I would definitely be aiming for 2.
I think that's fair. Like everybody has, and now to be fair, I think that there are a couple of ways that they could change that up. Like if they were to make a trade, free up another roster spot, maybe there is a guy that you wouldn't expect to be available that decides, okay, there is a way to get playing time in Denver now that there has been a move made. I could absolutely see somebody that is like, hey, you might even have a taxpayer mid-level exception guy that falls through the cracks and doesn't get that kind of money. They sign for a minimum for Denver and then try to get back out on the market. That's the way that Denver has to be floating these things. But again, it's all about relationships. It's all about expectations. I do think that David Adelman actually might help with that, just because it does seem like he's going to be a coach that is a little bit more open to going with a larger rotation on a consistent basis, maybe mixing and matching some different guys as opposed to having his 8 or 9 guys that he goes with every single night. Maybe that helps Denver recruit some other guys that they wouldn't necessarily have gotten before.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Kind of the archetype of guy I'd be looking for is a later career guy that probably already has some career earnings that are pretty good. And like you said, maybe he falls through the cracks a little bit on that taxpayer MLE, but he looks at it and he says, okay, I could go play in Denver next to Jokic for at least a little bit. And if things go well, then next year I'll be able to get one last good contract, right? So that's kind of the archetype of player I'd be looking for. And I think there's several of those out there that I'm sure we'll talk about.
To me, the belle of the ball there was Brook Lopez, somebody who's made $200 million in his career and is perfectly okay going to play a role somewhere. But I kind of think there are going to be other teams that just A, offer more money, or B, actually offer a starting spot for him, like the Lakers, for example. I would be shocked if Denver could get somebody like him, but I mean, I would make the call. I'd make the call to all of these guys if I could and say, hey, we want to get as good as possible, and you're going to have a role here no matter what. So that would be the kinds of guys that I'd be targeting as well. How concerned should Nuggets fans be if Russell Westbrook walks away? Because that doesn't seem like he certainly could just opt into that 3.5 million that he has, but you made the case that he would opt out. And then there's also a case that another team could just offer him more money, like with a taxpayer mid-level, because of the production that he provided in Denver, and the actual vibe that Russell Westbrook, I think, gives off to teams now, I think is probably a little bit stronger than where it was in LA.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll talk about his decision first and then the concern level. If Westbrook does opt out, I'd look at a team like the Warriors as a possible team that could go get him. It's close to home for Russ, and obviously a good team. I think they'd make some sense. The other one I would look at and say that would be a good situation for him would be if Giannis stays in Milwaukee, going there on a minimum where they say, hey, Lillard's out the whole year. You can come here and at least compete to be our starting point guard this year. I think that would be an attractive situation for him as well. So there are probably a couple others, but those are two main ones I'd look at. As far as concern level, I think it would be a little concerning when you look at how many minutes he played for you last year, regular season and playoffs. It's a lot to replace. Obviously, it's a new coaching staff. Maybe he doesn't play as much under this new coaching staff as he did under the old one. But I think there would be some concern there, because then you're kind of left with, okay, we're either putting Pickett right in, plug and play. Here's 1,500 minutes for you to take this year, and it's a lot. Or you're looking at having to make a trade to replace that spot. And, that can get really, really tough just because of Denver's limited assets. And then, if that doesn't work, you have some possible minimum free agent guys, but are any of them better than Pickett? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure you could find somebody that's more experienced, certainly, and somebody that has been in these situations before. Like, I've got a couple of names here that I would personally think are better. Another two names for Russ, by the way, Sacramento, who they publicly said we need a point guard, and Dallas, who they are without Kyrie Irving for the entire season. So kind of a similar situation to Lillard. Could Russ be a guy that steps in next to Anthony Davis, who he has a prior relationship with? That would not surprise me at all. Although that one didn't necessarily work out with the Lakers side of things, but who knows? Maybe it wasn't an Anthony Davis side of things. Okay. I have some names for the taxpayer mid-level exception that you're probably intimately familiar with, because I used your resource that everybody, and so for some of those names for sure, and then have tried to add in some of my own. Are you interested in hearing some of these?
Of course. I want to hear what you got.
Let's go. Tyus and Trey Jones both are, I think, the opposite versions of Russell Westbrook. Somebody like the public way that David Adelman was talking about slowing things down, being more of an execution based team, makes me lean into thinking, yeah, maybe you want a guy who doesn't turn the ball over as much, just spaces the floor, makes fewer mistakes. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And then Trey Mann, three different kinds of like two of the same kinds of players in Tyus Jones and Trey Jones, but Trey Mann being an RFA who you wrote about in your manifesto. What do you think of those three in particular?
Yeah, so starting off with the Jones, I like both of them as players. I think they'd be really good in Denver. Tyus was somebody that a lot of Nuggets fans wanted last year. I would have wanted him last year too, but it obviously just made more sense in Phoenix with the role that he could have. Um, they are very much of like the Monte Morris type of backup point guards, which is a good thing. They're low mistake, like you said. Uh, you would certainly cut back on your turnovers from what you had with Westbrook this year. But on the flip side of that coin, you would probably lose a little bit in terms of rim pressure that Westbrook could provide, and you would lose a little bit of pace. And I know there's a debate going on right now after some of David Adelman's comments about how important is pace. But I think with your bench point guard, you do kind of like a little bit of pushing the pace, especially when your home games are played in Denver. So positives and negatives for those guys, but I would like either of them here. And then Trey Mann is another guy I highlighted. I think there's some debate in Charlotte if they're going to give him his qualifying offer. And what that means is if they don't do that, it means he's an unrestricted free agent as opposed to a restricted one. And there'd be a good likelihood that he'd go somewhere else. Trey Mann, I would say, is more like probably like the Jordan Clarkson of like 5 years ago. So not the more recent one that's kind of had some rough years, but sort of the 6-man type that was in Utah, if people can remember him. I think that's kind of the cloth that Trey Mann is cut from. And I think there's going to be a smart team that goes and gets him if Charlotte doesn't keep him. And they're going to get a guy who can be a 6-man of the year type of guy. And so him, probably less realistic than either of the Jones guys. But I think there is some realistic routes there to getting him. And I think he'd be just a great microwave scorer off the Nuggets bench that they'd really enjoy having.
There is, I guess, a possibility that one of those guys could sign for a minimum, but I'm sure that in order to entice them to come to Denver, actually, I don't know if it's that much of an enticement because they're going to have a role. I think anybody can look at the way that Denver's backup point guards have gotten a lot of usage, a lot of run, especially while Jamal Murray has been the starter, that I think it's a pretty strong role for anybody that wants an opportunity. Another few guys on the wing, Delano Banton, kind of a hybrid option guard wing, very long, 6'9", gotten better as a shooter, but also just a pretty strong defender. Somebody who I think probably stays in Portland, but you never know. Bruce Brown, who everybody here is intimately familiar with, don't really need to go too much into depth on him. Sam Merrill of Cleveland, that's more of your shooter, your spacer, your outside mover, somebody who, if they were to move Julian Strawther in a deal, Sam Merrill would be a great option for Denver to kind of replace that skill set. And then Amir Coffey, somebody who I have long thought very highly of from the Clippers, who didn't play in that series against Denver, but I think probably could have. And certainly if he was on Denver, he would have. Somebody who I called him in my article that just dropped right before we started, the spiritual successor of Wilson Chandler, who is not necessarily good, like great at any one thing, but is good at pretty much everything. Any of those guys stand out?
Yeah, a couple of them do. I think so. Sam Merrill is a guy that I had originally highlighted for the Nuggets when he came out of the draft a number of years ago. Kind of what he is now is he'd sort of be like if you're targeting Luke Kennard, let's say, and you can't get Luke Kennard, I think Sam Merrill might be kind of one of the next guys you look at to fill that role.
Yeah.
Um, Sort of a shooter, um, slash a little bit, but he's right in that same sort of mold as Kennard, I think, and he'd be a good player here. Um, and then, yeah, Amir Coffey. I think it's exactly what you said. I think he's not really a specialist, but he's not going to hurt you in most ways. You can kind of put him out there and you can put him in different roles and he can do each of them pretty capably. I don't think he's going to excel at any one thing. But every time you put him out there that he's not going to kill you and he'll do his job. So I think he's definitely a good target. And I think there will be a smart team that gets him for sure.
That was just one of the things that Bruce Brown was so good at with the 2023 team. Every role that they put him in, he was able to adapt and find ways to be successful. It wasn't perfect all the time, but he certainly adapted. I think that Coffey would be very similar for Denver. And they've just been so weak on the wings over the course of these last couple seasons that without Bruce, it got a little bit worse. And then without KCP, it got a little bit worse. I think you just have to make a concentrated effort to try to build up that 3-and-D quotient once again, because Porter is very good at a 4. Like Gordon's very good at the 4. If you have to consistently play one of them at the 3 all the time, then you're going to be, I think you're going to be a little bit too big and too slow at times. So it's pretty understandable. Last 4 guys, or actually 5 guys, I'll throw at you, and then we're going to go to a second part, folks. Jake LaRavia, who I mentioned before, Taurean Prince, and Chris Boucher. We'll focus on those 3 right now, kind of your more forward types. LaRavia, more of a shooter. Taurean Prince, obviously more of a, definitely more of a spot-up guy, not really, I think LaRavia is probably a better shooter than him on the move, but Prince, of course, was very good from a standstill. Bit of a better defender. And then Chris Boucher, somebody that they targeted prior to in the trade deadline. If you had to give your TPMLE to one guy there, who would you give it to?
Out of that group, I would probably say Taurean Prince, maybe. I think he would kind of be similar in a way to like what Jeff Green provided when he came to Denver.
Yeah.
Like, I know it bugged a lot of people when he was here, but if people remember, Jeff Green kind of got a lot of plays ran for him off the bench. And it wasn't always a good thing, but like it was nice to have like some type of like system on your bench, a guy you could go to and run a play for him. Taurean Prince can do a little bit of that, and I think he's a pretty good shooter, and he's a good rebounder, and he's got positional size that's decent if you're playing him at like the 3, for example. And he can play some at the 4 too, so there's a little bit of versatility there. So I would probably give it to Prince out of that group, but I don't think Denver could go wrong picking any of those guys.
Final 2 are 2 Celtics, Al Horford and Luke Kornet. Could you sway big Al Horford with the Jason Tatum injury to come to Denver and provide some backup minutes for Jokic, maybe play next to him a little bit, or steal Luke Kornet from them, who I thought was pretty good for them this past season? Either of those 2 kind of backup center candidates really do anything for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I'd probably prefer Horford of the 2, but it's close. Obviously, they've both played in big games, which is a good thing. And backup center in this year's free agency is just really a tough one. There's not a lot of great options out there, just kind of like it is every year. And then you have teams that are going to take the top ones from you. Like we mentioned the Lakers earlier. If you have an offer this year from the Nuggets and the Lakers sitting on the table for a minimum, you're going to take the Lakers every time for the role, in addition to just like location and stuff, which is one of the things Denver has to face. But yeah, I would definitely go for Horford of those 2. Could you convince him to come to Denver? I'm not totally sure. But he would be a good target. Definitely worth making the call.
Okay. I like it. I think that there's of those different players, there's a lot of different ways that Denver could go. Obviously, I went through the positional spectrum there, and I'm not sure what the best call is for Denver, because if Russell Westbrook walks, you're going to want a point guard. If you think that you're going to move one of Peyton Watson or Julian Strawther at some point, then you're going to want a wing. If you're going to potentially want Deron Holmes to play the 4, you might want a 5. If you want Deron Holmes to play the 5, you might want a 4. There's a lot of different ways I think you could go. So we'll have to see what the front office decides and then where the direction that they go. But tell you what, we're going to break this into 2 parts. The next episode, folks, you're going to hear some minimum candidates, some players that I think Denver could, and they're going to have more of these on the list because there are more free agents that Denver can go to. But beyond that, we're going to do some trade talk. We're going to throw out some trades, and I think that there's going to be a lot there that you're not going to want to miss. So when we come back, we are going to do some trade talk on Pickaxe and Roll. We'll be right back here. Thank you for listening.